right now I'm going to measure hip flexion, and I will place the axis of the goniometer over the greater trochanter of the hip, and that's going to be right there. I need you to move your arms up, please. I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the greater trochanter. I'm going to have the stationary arm lined up with the trunk. I'm going to have the movable arm lined up with the midline of the femur. I'm going to ask them to bend their knee and lift their knee towards their chest as much as possible. Okay. Then I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the greater trochanter of the femur. I'm going to have the stationary arm lined up with the trunk, and then I'm going to have the movable arm lined up with the midline of the femur, like that. And I'm going to ask them to move as far as they can go. Okay, good. Now, for hip extension, I'm going to ask her to turn over and move towards me. I want you to land on your stomach and move towards me. Now for this, I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the greater trochanter again. I'm going to have the stationary arm lined up with the trunk, the movable arm lined up with the femur. Okay. Now for hip extension, I'm going to ask her to leave her leg straight and to lift your leg straight and lift your foot up towards the ceiling. Good, like that. Then I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer back over the greater trochanter. I'm going to have the stationary arm lined up with the trunk, the movable arm lined up with the midline of the femur, and that's hip extension. Okay. Then I'm going to ask her to roll back over to her back in a supine position. Okay. Now for hip abduction, I am going to place the goniometer across the stationary arm is going to be lined up with both of the ASISs, or the anterior superior iliac spines. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the midline of the femur. I'm going to ask her to move her foot out, away towards me. I'm going to then readjust the goniometer lined up with the ASISs and the movable arm lined up with the femur, with the midline of the femur. And that's how you do hip abduction. Now, for hip adduction, I have to have the person abduct their other foot, their opposite foot that you're testing. I am going to make sure that she's at 0 by placing the immovable arm, or the stationary arm, with her ASISs, or anterior superior iliac spines. The axis being over the anterior superior iliac spine that you're testing. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the femur. Then I'm going to ask her to move her foot towards her other foot, inwards. I'm going to readjust the goniometer over her ASISs, with the axis being over the ASIS that I'm testing. I will line up the movable arm with her femur, and that's hip adduction. Okay, now for hip internal and external rotation, I'm going to ask her to sit on the side of the mat. Okay, I am going to, the axis of the goniometer goes right over the patella, and both the stationary and movable arms are lined up with their tibia. For external rotation, I am going to have her bring the sole of her foot towards her opposite leg. So she's going to bend her leg this way. I am going to replace the axis of the goniometer over the patella. The stationary arm is going to be perpendicular to the floor. The movable arm is going to be realigned with the tibia here. And that's external rotation. For internal rotation, I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the patella. Both the stationary and movable arms are going to be lined up with the tibia. This time I'm going to ask her to move her sole of her foot outwards, away from her other foot. I'm going to make sure the axis of rotation again is placed over the patella. The stationary arm is perpendicular to the floor. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the tibia. Right there. Okay? And that's hip internal rotation. Okay. Okay. Now, for knee flexion, I am going to have her lay back on her back again. And now I'm going to I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the knee joint, where the knee joint is. I'm going to line up this stationary arm with the midline of her femur, and the movable arm lined up with the midline of her calf. I'm going to ask her to bring the bottom of her foot, the heel of her foot, towards her bottom, like that. I'm going to readjust to where the axis of rotation is through the knee joint. The stationary arm is going to be lined up with the midline of the femur. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the tibia, or the side of the calf. Now, for knee extension, I'm going to have the person bring their foot up towards their bottom. I'm going to start with the axis being placed over the knee joint, the movable arm with the midline of the femur, the stationary arm with the middle of the calf. Then I'm going to ask her to straighten her leg out all the way. Yep, straight out. Then I'm going to check and make sure that it is straight by placing the axis over the knee joint, the stationary arm with the midline of the femur, the movable arm with the middle of the calf. Okay? Now, for plantar and dorsiflexion and inversion and eversion, I'm going to have the person sitting on the side of the mat again. And can I have you take off this shoe? Okay. Now, for plantar flexion, I'm going to have the foot at neutral. I am going to have the stationary arm just distal to the lateral malleolus. I'm going to have, so the axis is going to be just distal to the lateral malleolus. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the top of the fifth metatarsal. The stationary arm is going to be lined up with the middle of the calf. Now for plantar flexion, I'm going to ask her to point her toes down towards the floor, and I'm just going to place the axis just distal to the lateral malleolus. I'm going to make sure that the stationary arm is lined up with the middle of her calf. Movable arm is lined up with the top, over the top of the fifth metatarsal. Okay. Now for plantar flexion, I'm going to place the person in neutral again, with the axis of the goniometer being placed just distal to the lateral malleolus. The stationary arm is going to be lined up with the calf. The movable arm just above the top of the fifth metatarsal. And then for dorsiflexion, I'm going to ask her to bring her toes towards her leg and move them up. So point your toes up. Okay, I'm going to replace the axis of rotation over just distal to the lateral malleolus. Make sure the stationary arm is in the middle of the calf. Make sure that the movable arm is on top of the 5th metatarsal, and that's ankle dorsiflexion. Now, ankle, I'm going to need your hands up. Sorry. Just a little bit longer. So, now for ankle inversion and eversion, I'm going to have the axis of rotation placed over the top of the foot. The stationary arm is going to be lined up with the tibia. The movable arm is going to be lined up with the 2nd metatarsal. Now I'm going to ask her to move the sole of her foot inward, and I'm going to keep the axis of rotation right where her ankle is. I'm going to have the movable arms lined up, the stationary arm lined up with her tibia, and then the movable arm is going to be lined up with their 2nd metatarsal again. Okay. And that was ankle inversion. For ankle eversion, I'm going to place the axis of the goniometer over the ankle joint. I'm going to have the stationary arm lined up with their tibia, the movable arm lined up with their 2nd metatarsal. I'm going to ask her to point the sole of her foot outward. Nope, outward. Okay. And I'm going to place the axis of goniometer over her ankle joint, the stationary arm lined up with the tibia, the movable arm lined up with her 2nd metatarsal. Try to move that sole of the foot outward as much as possible. Good. And make sure that's lined up with the 2nd metatarsal. And that is ankle eversion.